Theory is that long live theory, the end of the great debates and the rise of electricity in the international relations. David A. Lake, University of California, San Diego, USA. Abstract. The history of the discipline of international relations is commonly told in terms of great debates. These intellectual clashes resolve, title, and indeed continue to this day. Underneath this narrative is an alternative history of significant progress through mid-level and eclectic theories of world politics. After reviewing the great debates, this counter-narrative is developed and then supported by reviews of open economy, politics, and democratic peace theory. A new line of cleavage is emerging in the field between positivist and the post-positivist. However, that overlaps with the second and the final great debates. Like all other before it, and this potentially great debate, if it occurs, will be inconclusive. The field would be better off focusing on important real world problems and achieving progress within each approach according to its own criteria for success. Keywords: democratic base, epistemology, international relations theory, open economy, politics, and paradigms. Introduction. The field of international relations has a long tradition of great debates, but both grand theory and clashes between competing grand theories now appear to be one of wane. Many international relationists bemoan the dominance of the normal science, a phrase almost always uttered in a derogatory manner. Yet, if grand theory was king, it was an evil tyrant. The great debates did help clarify the differing assumptions scholars make in their theories, though this is a low bar to clear. Despite the attention they received, however, nothing was ever resolved. Indeed, as I shall explain, each of the three great debates continues to this day. Most insidiously, the debates took to the form of paradigm wars, in which the focus was less on how to explain world politics and more on which set of assumptions best capture the inherent nature of humans as political animals or states as political organizations. The paradigm wars perverted the discipline and turned inquiry into contest of quasi-religious beliefs in the power of one or another. Lake. If I, for one, do not mourn the tyrant's passing, flourishing in the interest of great debates, however, has always been a rich ecosystem of other theories, often competing, that never rose to the level of great debates, but nonetheless produced significant progress over time in improving our understanding of international relations. This article focuses on such a strain of theory, mid-level theory, and mm, that they forms a basis for more progressive and eclectic approach to international relations. Sil Anstein, 2010. Mid-level theory is not new but is rising to greater prominence now that the great debates have lost their stridency. It is less exciting than the great debates. Mid-level theory, precisely because it is eclectic and focuses on what works, does not inflame the passions like allegiance to this or that paradigm. At mid-level theory, I argue, can form the basis of for a progressive discipline of international relations that the paradigms have never provided. This contender for the crown deserves support. This article proceeds in four stages. The first part review the great debates in international relations and some of the recent critical historiography on these periods of the supposed scholarly ferments. The second part develops an alternative narrative of the field that highlights mid-level theory. The third part surveys two streams of mid-level theory to demonstrate the potential for progress within the approach. The fourth part outlines what may become another great debate between positivist and post-positive that in turn overlap with the second and the final great debate. This is real line of cleavage in the discipline today, which threatens to become ever wider in year ahead. Like all the others, This nascent debate, if it occurs, will be in- inconclusive. We would all be better off, I argue, focusing on achieving progress within each approach that addresses important real world problems. The great debates debated. The history of the field of IR is typically told as a series of great debates, epic battles between titans that shape the direction of inquiry and knowledge for decades afterwards. What was at stake in each of these debates has been and continues to be reinterpreted in the light of development in the real world and the current disciplinary struggle. Indeed, there is now a significant body of revisionist history that challenges that the debates were supposedly about, and even if they occurred at the all. History, even disciplinary history, is also contested even more so. The biggest story of theoretical and empirical progress embedded in a history of the great debates is almost certainly wrong. Yet the conventional account appears to retain some hold on the discipline, as Weaver notes. There is no other established means of telling the history of discipline. The first great debate began on the eve of the World War II, supposedly unfolded between the idealist dominant from the founding of the discipline in early 20th century and the realists who triumphed in the decade after 1945, coming out of tradition of formal legal theory and progressive politics. Idealists focused on the potential role of the institution in improving the human condition and mitigating conflict between states. This quest was in part driven by the destructiveness of the World War First, but found founded on the inability of international institutions to prevent World War II. Though, of course, that was a high hurdle for any progressive reform, claiming to take human nature and the world as they are, but really taking them by assumptions. Realists sought more clearly to explain actual patterns of world politics and to identify pragmatic steps leaders might take to improve diplomacy and world order. This clear-eyed, or some might say more cynical interpretation of human nature and the focus on the conflict inherent in the struggle of power both informed Western policy during the Cold War and in turn was reinforced by the decades-long struggle. Keller. Critics now dispute the notion of coherent idealist school in the interwar years and argues that it was challenged even in its supposed heyday by pluralists who questioned the state centrism of their coll- colleagues and focused on the modern condition of the interdependence and transnational relations, though the concepts were not yet framed in those terms. Keller, Long and Wilson, Smith. Similarly, it is not clear that the realism was a single school. There were strong continuities between prominent realists and early thinkers, especially those who focused on the power politics and the balance of power. Ideas that were hardly new to the post war era. To make the story even more complex, there were substantial overlaps in the thinking of so called idealist and early realist. Osiander. Presaging the behavioral revolution of the second debate, the dividing line might be drawn more clearly between idealists who focus on the international organization and realists who broaden the field to study international politics. The claim that realism somehow won this first debate is also erroneous, in my view, as the victory was never truly consolidated and was soon challenged by the liberalism. Cooper, Cohen, and I. Rosecrans, New Liberal Institution, Cohen, 1984, ultimately constructivism, Rook and Wendt, The first great debate as the class of alternative paradigm did not end, but rather is a continuing thread in the history of discipline and even overlaps with the final great debate below. The second great debate, reaching its height during 1960s, is usually cast as a battle between traditionalists and behavioralists or scientists. Traditionalists emphasize the complexity of world politics, the role of contingency and leadership in diplomacy, and the unique nature of the each historical juncture, claiming that no scientific theory could ever capture the interplay of so many factors not explaining choice by human beings who could learn by experience. Tradition focus on the moment of inflection in in his theory in history in which world politics could have gone one way or the other. Bull. Behaviorism came late to international relations, at least compared to other areas of the political science, but it arrived with the force of deep argument already rehearsed elsewhere in the social science. Behaviorists skewed the uniqueness of the particular episode and sought to identify classes of events, looking for and highlighting commonalities across, for instance, all interstate wars. Singer, having identified classes of event, behaviorists could then build up generalization by induction or empirically confirmed deduction. By the 1970s, the behaviorists declared victory. This standard account of the second debate is also increasingly challenged. The attempt to define international relations as a science began not with the behavioral revolution in 1950s, but in the Chicago School of 1920s and 1930s, and turned the behavioralists were prompting not science in general, but as a particular kind of science focused on systems theory, a still deeply contested domain. Similarly, like the first great debate, this one also remains a running battle with the traditionalists, still vibrant throughout the field, especially within the English school, Linklater and Suganami, and possibly even dominant in Europe, where constructivism and the various forms of reflectivity have taken deep hold on the discipline. That despite the behaviorist assertion of supremacy, the second great debate remains alive and is still a major cleavage in the field. The last great debate is in many ways the hardest to identify, as the conventional narrative is not one but two or possibly three different stories. Some see a third debate arising in the 1970s between realism, liberalism, and radicalism, and the fourth debate occurring in the 1980s between new realism, liberalism, and the constructivism. Weber. This is not an unreasonable characterization given the attention devoted to the class of paradigms in this era. As applied above, this debate or set of debates is better understood, in my view, as a continuation of first debate. Others see the third debate, sometimes the fourth or fifth debate, as fighting the positivists as the successor of the behaviorists, or sometimes called against reflectivists, giving it a more ontological cast. Cohen and Lapid. It is this what I will call final debate, and that I want to focus on here. The term positivist was always something of a misnomer, as few were naive methodological falsifications in the same outlined by Popper. An alternative labor, rationalists fit equality purely. Rather, positivists were grab bags of approaches grouped by a general commitment to social science as a method and assumptions that individuals and other political actors are internalist and calculating their action. By 1980s, these so-called positivists continued the mainstream of the discipline of international relations. Reflective in terms were hardly a single school either, boldly united by a belief in the potential openness of various taken for granted aspects of world politics. Several strands of theorizing competed. including at least constructivism. Elder went postmodernism, critical theory, and feminism. Several of these approaches share the normative position of idealism. Others are more social versions of realism, as explained in more detail in the fourth part of the article. Some reflectivist why epistemology are critical realists, more an anti-positivists who believe social change in the pursuit of inquiry, not explanations. The diversity of approaches under the heading of reflectivism like made this final debate less silent, as the assault on the positivist was less unified than in the past cases. Perhaps for this reason, perhaps because it overlapped so much with the paradigm wars of the first great debates and the epistemological differences in the second. Some challenge the idea that there ever was a final great debate, seeing it more as a series of small battles than an epic struggle. More accurately, the final debate might be best understood as the fracturing of the field into multiple overlapping identity groups, each seeking to bolster and affirm its own theoretical turf against not only the mainstream of the discipline but against each other as well. No approach won this debate, although the positivists remained ensconced and as the center of the field. Positivists either subsumed the critics offered by the reflectivists, as one Richard Ashley, 1986 perspective critic, that new realism was statist before it was realist, led to a decade of innovative positivist theorizing of concept of the sovereignty. For instance, Krasner, or just simply ignored and marginalized them. At the same time, the end of the Cold War, despite the absence of any change in the objective nature of international systems, supported more reflectivist views on social constructed nature of previously objective structure, propelling the debate along. Evangelista Kirchstein. Like earlier episode, the final great debate, whatever it was never resolved. In rather anticlimactic way, the various schools of the thought, positivist and reflectivist alike, have simply retreated to their own corners of multi-sided boxing rings, occasionally tossing a punch in one or the other direction, but more often talking about themselves and complaining of not being taken seriously by others. Like all narrative, this account of our field, even in its revisionist form, leaves out part of the story, and for this reason, I am reluctant to recount it to new students or reify it by frequent retelling. It is, of course, a North American or possibly US European story, with few voices from the developing world being heard. Hoffman, Tickner, Weaver. Even with this frame, however, in focusing on the great debate, the conventional story wittingly or not ignores many other possible narratives, some of which are explored elsewhere in this special issue without minimizing the importance of other counter narrative. I focus on one alternative mid-level theory that is often overlooked precisely because it is so close to the dominant one. Telling its story puts the debate about the end of theory and internationalism in new light. In the interstices, percolating alongside the paradigms of the first epistemologies of the second great debates and the ontologies of final great debates have always been a variety of eclectic mid-level theorist approaches sharing a positivist and internationalist approach to politics, rooted in the critical approaches of the interwar period. For instance, these alternatives flowered with the Vietnam War and the shattering of the myth of national interest that could be discerned by an objective observer to account for the diversity of opinion within states. Scholars do a new psychology Jervis and bureaucratic politics Allison, interest group, garbage, public opinion, Halsey, Ronsno, political institution, Walt, and the state structures. Katzenstein. The object of this theorizing was to explain political differences over one policy and why different countries might react to common stimuli in different ways at different times. Thus, Gorwich studied how the first Great Depression was reflected through different constellation of interest groups in several European countries and resulted in differing trade policies. Stein examined how interdependence was conditioned by varying state structures in advanced industrialized country, and the Jervis highlighted the role of conjunctive wise and interpreting and responding to crisis parallel with the domestic turn in international relations. Other drew a game theory to explain how states might produce suboptimal outcomes despite their good intentions. Explored oil, selling, Cinder, and teasing. Much of this work came together in 1980s in the newly revitalized field of security studies, Poison, Cinder, Walt, and the nascent field of the international political economy, Frieden, Goldstein, Goa, Haggard, Milner, or Odell. Although sometimes forced into one or another paradigmatic works to conform to the dominant narrative of the field, these approaches were never clearly realist, liberal, or later constructivist. All were moreover characterized by methodological pluralism, drawing equally or history and case studies on the other hand, large and data sets on the other, the often emphasizing historical contingency. They nonetheless also look to broader patterns of the world politics. Finally, all were and still are mid-level theories and focus on part of the political process rather than the whole, and the study of the aspects of the one or more variables on policy choices and outcomes. Bridging and in many cases simply violating boundaries between the levels of analysis. This strain of theorizing about the international politics was self-concisely eclectic, even as the traditional narrative and the discipline have focused on the great debates, watching the titans battle toward the inconclusive ends. These mid-level theorists have labored to produce the SS's theory of foreign policy and the international affairs with the varying assumptions that apply to specific issues and even limited historical periods. It is hard to measure how much research in the international relations is directed towards and fits neatly with the great debates, and how much falls into the more eclectic traditions. And my admittedly biased and the subjective estimate, it seems to me that majority of the work in our field since its founding have likely fallen into the later category. At mid-level theory has left out to the traditional narrative of the field, relegated to the subordinate theme of the footnotes. This alternative or counter narrative yields a different conclusion of the state of the theory or the end of the theory in international relations. Since the final great debates subtle to a close, the field has suffered in the view of some from absence of a great disciplined wide struggle. This is liberating since this ism of whatever forms argued elsewhere have exerted a pernicious effect on the disciplinary regard. Lake. Thus, if by the end of the theory we mean the absence of the new great debate, I can only stand and cheer in the silence created by end of the great debates, or at least the temporary hiatus electric theory had gained into prominence. Electric theory is not new. The counter narrative indicates that has been here all along, but relegated to the being Soviet players rather than the heroes of the story, but as a deceivably theoretical, if not of grand form favored by those who wish for the return of the great debates. Electric theory is the source of some of the most progressive research in our discipline. In my view, it represents the future of international relations, not a new future since it already has a long history, but the future nonetheless. Progress via mid-level theory. Progress is a contested term that makes different meaning in different ontologies. Positive and intentionalist electric theories are best judged by Lakatos. Definition of progress as the accumulation of knowledge and discovery of new fact. The paradigms in international relations, like all paradigms, Cohen, are defined by the sets of the assumptions that form the basis of more specific theories. IR paradigms, however, are typically incomplete, meaning that the assumptions are, as a set, insufficient to predict specific behaviors or outcomes. As a result, the hardcore assumptions of each paradigm must be augmented by auxiliary assumptions, Elman and Elvin. Lakatos, 1978, implying that it is possible to have multiple specific theories of say war that have equal claim to being realist. These multiple possible theories within the across paradigms could be judged by their contribution to knowledge and sought by progress, and instead advocates of different theories within the same paradigm have chosen to compete for the soul of the approach, each claiming to be the true exemplar. In turn, advocates of each paradigm have likewise chosen to defend their core assumptions against criticism or charge of insufficiency. This is as if the philosophers of the science recognizes normal. But in IR, this competition has had the effect of turning theories into the faiths that must be defended at all cost. Unfortunately, this all too often transfers the research enterprises from one of the exam explaining the world politics into one of proving realism, liberalism, and whatever is the one true faith in which all should adhere. Like the paradigm war has have not led to progress under almost any definition, or and certainly not in the one post here. Electric mid-level theory begins from a very different point, cell and stain. Rather than defending any single set of assumptions, Edwards' theories of address a specific problem of the world politics. Theories of war, for instance, will likely contain different assumptions and focus on different processes from theories of human rights or the environment. Mid-level theories may also violate the levels of analysis in IR, sometimes treating branches of government, for instance, as the unit of the observation in one country and the state as the unit in another. Milner. In this approach, there are no primordial units of analysis, only methodological bets about which unit of aggression is most likely to produce tractable and empirical powerful explanation, Lake and Wall. In similar ways, rather than slavish adherence to power, security, or wealth maximization as a universal goal, the units posted and different theories are also understood to possess different interests, including socially constructed interests tailored to the specific of the issue under investigation. It is precisely this mixing and matching of assumptions, issues, areas, unit, and interest that makes this sort of theorizing electric. Importantly, in the last decade or so, there has been an increasing and, in my view, appropriate demand that mid-level theories have explicit micro foundations, or as George and Bennett call it, as causal mechanism. In other words, theories are preferred which can link the incentives and the action of real individuals or possible groups of relatively homogeneous and individual to policy outcomes in a consistent way. It is not enough to simply possess that intentionally oriented businesses likely to get investment protections. For instance, ideally theory will specify how owners and the shareholders as a group define their interests, mobilize for political actions, develop a strategy to counter the actions of opposing political groups, and they bring pressure to bear and on politicians embedded in the political institution that in terms constrain their action. Theory should then explain how state with different society generated.